Thank you, Professor Miglione, for inviting me. It is an humbling experience to speak after Amara, and first, it's really a challenge for me. And also, I think to understand that if we are 4 in 2 hours, we have less than 30 minutes. We have to try to have 20 minutes, 25, okay. Yeah, I try, I thought 30 minutes, but I look at the time there. I try to manage in order to give time. So, a Mediterranean identity. The Mediterranean is a sea in the middle of lands. This is the only thing that I feel I can say with a margin of certainty about the Mediterranean. Premise. When I try to explain to my students what the Mediterranean is, I start by asking, what is the Mediterranean? To arrive to the obvious conclusion that the Mediterranean is not only a sea in the middle of lands, but also the cultural community developed on its shores, and even including areas with no Mediterranean shores, like Portugal and Jordan. I simplify and probably tell only a very partial truth. In fact, I find attempts of defining the Mediterranean pluriverse versus universe, if not always misleading, certainly very distracting. In name of an ideal Mediterranean, the idea of Mediterranean, one often risks to ignore that while we are talking, bombs explode and people shipwreck. The tears of Achilles seem to obfuscate the tears of nowadays. Miguel de Cervantes describes a character who is taken so much by his literary inspiration as to scream, "Fire, fire," while he is composing verses narrating the fall of Troy, thus provoking panic among the other guests of the inn where he resided. This episode of the poet is a warning for me against my indulging in Pindaric flights on Xenia, hospitality, Timea, glory after death, Kleos, recognition in life, Homo Mediterraneus versus Homo Atlanticus, the Nostos, the nostalgia, the role of Greek tragedy in shaping the Mediterranean sense of measure, honor and shame, and so on and so forth. Thus, I do not start with an attempt to define an identity, but rather I start with an identikit. Mediterranean identikit. The Mediterranean today is an area that presents at least these major features. A, an economic gap north-south. It has not always been that. There have been centuries in which the economic gap was with the privileged south versus the north, or traditionally the east versus the west. But now it's north-south, with a powerful, economically powerful north. B, a demographic gap. North-south again, but with inverted proportions. The north makes fewer children, this population shrinks, whereas the south is still rather prolific. C, as a consequence of A and B, we have an osmotic passage from the south to the north, just osmosis, migration. The reasons can be economic and or political, or even, as Amara introduced yesterday, longing for adventures toward an Occident, Europe, as a target of Occidentalism, if you pass my expression that of course is taken after Orientalism. The view how the Occident is viewed by the others. So at least by reading one of the first books of migrant literature, in which the main protagonist dreams of Italy as a country of sexual paradise, among the many things. The book is Immigrato. D, so A, B, C, now D. The presence in the Mediterranean of a conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian, that somehow has turned, or was turned, into the epitome of an alleged class of civilization. And again, I agree with our guest, the distinguished Gerd, that is just an invention, the idea of a class, for people who can benefit from them. It has always been like that, from Piran on. Islam, in its ontology, I say that for the students. I know that the distinguished guests don't need me to tell them that, but I see there are students. So Islam in its ontology, in its intellectual core, belongs to the Western civilization. That must be set clear. If there is a clash, it is rather a civil war, not a clash of different civilizations. Okay? We all know that in its core, Islam is a revealed religion, it's an Abrahamic religion, so it's from the tradition of Judeo-Christian, and it's a continuous discussion with Aristotelian ethics. So it's Western, and then we'll see also why. Point E, A, B, C, D, E, and I will summarize. The rise of fundamentalisms, that is, the radical non-acceptance of any exogenous element. In the past, the English historian Toynbee had named this phenomenon as a zealotism. He rightly identified it as one way to react to an invasive foreign presence, as opposite to Herodism, that today we will call assimilation, that is, the passive acquiescence to the foreign invasiveness. I add that, in my opinion, the passive acquiescence is usually welcoming the exterior, often not the most noble features of the invasive society. I could quote Monty Python, but we don't have time. I heard a Tunisian scholar to bring as an example of modernity the fact that in many Muslim countries in the early 70s, women wore miniskirt and drinking was allowed. Here is my objection to such a vision of modernity and progress. Is this what primarily defines a Western civilization? Is what one must take from the West? Now, I cannot delve into that, but if you want to have an idea, a literary idea of the birth of fundamentalism, you can read an episode in the book Yagubian Building, by the Egyptian author Salawi, I don't know if I pronounce well, in which we see how a corrupt establishment of leaders who are profoundly anti-Islamic, due to its corruption, encourages the birth of fundamentalism. But there are buts, and we'll see later. Enough for the identikit. So identikit is gap north-south in economic and inversely in demographic terms, osmosis, migration, a conflict that has become a symbol, a conflict has become much more than a local conflict, and the rise of fundamentalism, not all Islamic one. Point 2, Mediterranean as a paradigm. The identikit does not say much of the identity on the deep soul of the Mediterranean. An identity analyzes the process that leads to that moment. The identikit is only a snapshot. But when we speak of the Mediterranean, we have to speak in terms of thousands of years. The process are not 60 or 80 or 90 years. The identity doesn't say much of the identity, but it offers a valid reason to study this region. I'm declaring this with the practical goal of convincing university administrators, if there are any, about the benefits of implementing Mediterranean studies as a discipline. Because the Mediterranean acts as a paradigm. And that's not my theory. I'm quoting Abulafia, who speaks of paradigm, of Mediterraneans. Okay, Abulafia teaches in Cambridge. How? Is not the Mediterranean a sea in the middle of lands, as we said at the beginning? So are the Black Sea, the Red, the Caribbean, the Baltic, the Yellow, and so forth. All these maritime areas present some of the features that we described as part of the Mediterranean identikit. For instance, the Caribbean presents the economic gap, the potential for waves of migrants toward North America. I could bring many more examples. Therefore, the Mediterranean area must be studied as a paradigm to understand what happened, what is happening, and even more important, I believe, what could happen in similar areas of the world in the future. The Mediterranean as a playground for global approach. Time has a right to devote attention to the identity issue. I tried to escape a little bit. As a matter of fact, I repented of giving this title on the spur of the moment, but I was, and I was obliged. I was in the field, and now I have to fight. What do we define as identity? The term derives from Latin, the Treccani Encyclopedia states, identitas identitatis, from idem, the same. In philosophy, the principle of identity affirms that EA is equal to A, and it is not equal to non-A. And that already starts scaring me, because it's very difficult in a porous reality like the Mediterranean to establish what is equal and what is not. In psychology, the concept represents the awareness of one's own uniqueness, and also the idea of uniqueness scares me a little bit. More in general, can you hear me? Okay. More in general, the concept refers to the components that allow something to be recognizable as an autonomous identity. And this is, in my view, a very dangerous concept. That's why I have a problem in struggling with concept of identities. It gets more and more dangerous if applied to large human consortia. Why is it dangerous? Because it inevitably tends to create divisions. I versus the others. We, as a group, different from them. Defining an identity, history shows, paves the way to principles of exclusion, and that's xenophobia and nationalisms. Let's think of the result of the folklore myths and the genius loci or genius loci from the late 18th century on. And in the Mediterranean, we have thousands of years before a similar precedent when we establish a monotheistic religion with a jealous God. I'm respectfully disagree with you. The monotheism in the Mediterranean is not always a positive presence, in my opinion, for the creation of a unification. My Mediterranean, at last. Pure relativism is, however, in my opinion, equally dangerous as a strong categorizing thinking. I come from legal studies, so I have the tendency to put everything in category, and that's why I fight it, and I try to fight this mental absolutism. But then it's necessary to put order in our thought and creating categories, which are just to be demolished by someone else. We need to organize our thoughts. Thus, I venture in the perilous strait between the Scylla and Charybdis of ideological absolutism and relativism. I will give you my view of the Mediterranean, assuming that you all agree that there are as many Mediterraneans as are those who try to define it. After all, Pirandello was a very Mediterranean Sicilian author, so I'm paraphrasing. And I also dodge the temptation to find refuge in the comfort of a sort of negative theology of the Mediterranean by mentioning only what the area is not. I say for the students, you might know that negative theology is definition of God just by what God is not, or something medieval in the medieval thought, especially St. Thomas. My Mediterranean, and here it's my vision of the Mediterranean, my identity, is the Janus bifront. One face is the material component, the so-called reality. The other is the ideal and idealized component. The two faces kiss and bite each other. None of them can survive without the other, though each one affects the other. The humanistic component is crucial. We tend, humanists, to think that it is indispensable, but we must also think that there is another approach to the Mediterranean of the sociologists, the Mediterranean of the physicians, of the environmentalists, of the biologist, and the two components constitute what I call the esprit de finesse, esprit de géométrie, by quoting Pascal, of course, of the approach of the Mediterranean. So, the material side is made of the mingling among people dwelling in the area. And now I have to say something very harsh, and I know that it's a very sensitive topic, but if there is a hero, I use really a provocative expression, in the Mediterranean, that's rape. Yeah, I know you are looking at me with all what we do in a school to say, but the Mediterranean mingling of genes, of DNA, is through rape. A society that for thousands of years was based on pillage, on piracy, on slavery, on marauders, on merchants. The wives came from the same ethnic group, from the same social class, from the same religious group. But the others, they came from everywhere. And that spread this Mediterranean DNA through the thousands of years. That's why an Algerian is Italian, not so much for the Italian passport, in my opinion, but because it's Algerian. Because it's way to conceive of, not only physically, but the hospitality and the friendship is the same. Okay, it's not much a legal thing, but it's really a cultural thing, developed for thousands of years. Unfortunately, the ideal, I said the real, the ideal by many is made by the many nice things that you can read in plethora of books and articles. I suggest Franco Cassani, but there are plenty of books from Spanish authors, from Camus, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, the intersection of the material with the ideal does not represent a Mediterranean peculiarity only. Every human consortium is a result between a material urge and intellectual frame. Thus, this is not a satisfactory definition. I'm sorry, but I'm disappointing you. I'm not yet giving a definition. Because if an identity of the Mediterranean is to find a uniqueness, the tension between an ideal world and a practical world, it's in any society. It's in any individual. I go ahead to refine my definition by adding the Mediterranean is the oxymoron. At least using a Greek word, I'll give more. The paradox. Its intellectual premises are divided into dichotomies: hot and cold, death and life, body and spirit, man and woman, light and dark, and of course, God, good and evil. And you might be surprised also to know that the dualism, good and evil, the presence of God and Satan, comes after monotheism, not before. Comes to explain the problem of evil in the world. If we have one single God who is a God of goodness, how can we explain evil? And the Persians helped us with the idea of Satan. Satan is a Persian originally word. Okay, so we passed from polytheism to a so-called evolutionary polytheism to the revolutionary monotheism, and then we needed to explain evil in the world. And so we created Satan. Of course, I speak as a non-believer. Yet, this oxymoron, I mean, this society made on dichotomies, on sharp division, good and evil, presents, or better presented in the past, a certain pragmatic flexibility. I insist on saying presented because events happened in the last 3 centuries have dramatically modified balances that had lasted for thousands of years. I still repeat, when I speak of Mediterranean, I speak of thousands of years. The first Mediterranean city, Jericho, I mean the first recorded city, was 8,000 years before current era, so 10,000 years ago. Yet, I'm not satisfied with definition either. So I said that is a tension between the ideal and the real, but that's everywhere. I said that is the oxymoron. Well, what is more oxymoric than American society? So, yet I'm not satisfied with this definition either. If identity means the quest for a criterium discriminationis, for a unique cipher of the Mediterranean, the coexistence between people in flesh and bones and theoretical abstraction does not fulfill the purpose. Every human consortium, oftentimes an individual, is a paradox of the coexistence, or at least 2 contrasted forces. We have also a term for that, psychomachi. We would not have Petrarca otherwise. So, probably, and that's the point, so now I have to call for your patience, and we find the uniqueness of the Mediterranean, therefore its identity, if identity means uniqueness, if we investigate the reasons of this paradox. Investigate. I knew that I would be surrounded by scholars, so I came not with a theory, but with ideas that I share with you and want to have feedback from you. My Mediterranean is the interplay among the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also between them and the Greco-Roman philosophy and rhetoric. Between them and the plurimillenary substratum of culture that preceded both the Greek philosophy of the classical time and the so-called Judean monotheistic revolution. We have no time for examples, but There is an Anatolian myth of Attis, of a god born from a virgin, killed, and resurrected 3 days later, and that was 3 centuries before Christ. I cannot give you many examples how many Torah's rules and constructs are from Babylonian, starting from by the word Kippur, or from mythology that was spread all over the Mediterranean, not only Greek. There are plenty of books. If you want to inform yourself, you have possibility. And we all know that St. Augustine said to the preachers, Christian preachers, cherish any single word of Cicero, but Cicero was a pagan. Okay, that's a great interplay. We all know that the Christian rhetoric, the father of the church, owes a lot to pagan ethics. And we all know that Dante's Inferno is an Aristotelian ethic. I do insist that we should not dismiss the legacy of values, ideas, ethical principles that derive from cultures that were already ancient when the Achaeans and the tribes of Israel were marauders in the region. There is no time here to bring evidence of how the aforementioned interplays affected the shaping to the Mediterranean identity, from the arts to social mores, from economic policies to diet, and so forth. I just mentioned that in the program of Mediterranean studies that I created in my institution, the class of Mediterranean religion is a requirement. Space, time. We have a class of geography of the Mediterranean. We cannot call it geography, but it's geography. A class of history of the Mediterranean. We cannot call history, we have to call civilization. And a class on religions in the Mediterranean. I go to the conclusion. The audience will wonder. It started in name of pragmatism, the Mediterranean in the middle of the land. What is more evident than that? And now is advocating for cultures that flourished thousands of years ago. Where is the logic? I'm challenging the idea that all started with the Greeks and the Bible. And again, I'm challenging with my own convictions because I am son of that tradition, especially the Greek one. In the last years, some scholars propose a complete remapping of the Mediterranean zone, either by debunking the actual state boundaries or enlarging, righteously in my opinion, the geocultural notion of the Mediterranean as far as to India. They speak of Indian Mediterranean. There is also an association called Indian Mediterranean. In this intellectual debate, I think that it is recommendable to be aware of the ideological and political premises that stand behind the credited great pillars of the Mediterranean world. I say political because monotheism, if we don't look at that in religious terms, was a coup d'etat of the rabbinical class. That's what scholars of religious studies tell us. The religious premise that stand behind the credited great pillars of the Mediterranean world, because that can help explain the oxymoron, and that's the point. How come that we are looking for a uniqueness? The uniqueness is not the oxymoron, but the origin of the oxymoron. How we arrive to this oxymoron, because the paradox in any society. But let's see what are the peculiarities of the Mediterranean paradox. The oxymoron between rigid ideological, and I'm finishing, dichotomy and actual flexibility. In the epoch defined by scholars of religions as evolutionary monotheism, as opposed to the revolutionary monotheism, the approach to the divinity in the Mediterranean was rather a sort of sharing a common good in the belief that all creeds are glimpses on an unfathomable metaphysical reality. There was a continuous exchange of gods and goddesses. That explains also the horse of Troy, why the Trojan wanted a horse that was a cult of the enemies. But that explains this idea. When we were children, we played with little figurine. I have it, you don't have. And the ancient Mediterranean world played with gods like that. That explained why Isis was all over, the myth of Isis, changing name or in her own name, all over the Mediterranean. Someone sees also in the Madonna some reminiscence of Isis. This vein of acceptance of the other, at least of the religion of the other, no matter if enemy, explains the tears of Achilles. You remember Achilles cries, when he sees Priam crying. But not because he's in an Hollywood movie, he's not repenting. No, he would kill Hector hundreds of times, but he cries because he recognizes in Priam, in his enemy, the dignity of a father. The enemy is not devil, he's not evil. He's a father anyway, even if an enemy. That's the greatness of that moment that we receive from the Achaean tradition. So, they explain the tears of Achilles and constitutes one of the possible explanations for the Mediterranean paradox. One assertive way of grasping the sense of human life, there is God and there is Satan, and one more fluid, more ecological. Is this other component probably not the one they want to recuperate in order to create a Mediterranean in which bombs do not explode? Is this not the way to proceed to the dialogue, and I quote you, Amar, again, by recuperating an ethos that had no absolutism, no jealous gods, no chosen people? By the way, for the Egyptian, it was a sin to make people sad. Thank you very much.